So I'm using the Mozilla Developer Network AI feature. This is a feature that gets unlocked if somebody's like a supporter. I think it's like $5 a month or something. And it gives you access to the AI. Kind of fun. And, support's a good cause also. At the same time, the docs are pretty good here, so one can just manually look things up. But here, I've asked for an explanation and examples of the map method, discussing how this is a functional approach. What I'd like you to do right now is just pause the video and read through this on your own and try to translate it, maybe talk it out loud, maybe jot down some notes, so that you can kind of explain it to yourself before you hear the official explanation, if you will. So go ahead, pause the video. And let's read through this together now. The map method in JavaScript is a powerful tool for transforming arrays in a functional programming style. So these array methods, we'll focus on map, but there's several of them. They are a great representation and use of functional programming in JavaScript. So this is to be contrasted with the procedural or imperative style, where we're doing like for or while loops, and we would essentially teach JavaScript how to loop. We would specifically say, start at 0 and keep going until you get to the length of the array. And by the way, don't forget to increment by 1 each time. And it was just, everything was spelled out step by step. Well, it turns out that JavaScript is kind of smart enough to know how to iterate over an array. So rather than spelling that out, we can use a functional or declarative style where we will just tell JavaScript, we'll declare, hey, JavaScript, this is our array, and this is what we want done with the array. We don't worry about those inner details about how we start at 0 and etc., okay? So that's what we mean by a functional or a declarative style. It's more about declaring by using a callback function, declaring what we want done with that array rather than going through, what's the procedure? How do we loop over an array? So it applies a function to each element of an array. And that right there is our callback function. Because we have an array of whatever it is, names, numbers, whatever it may be, and we're just declaring what we want done. How do we declare that? Well, we write a function, and then we pass that into the map method, and JavaScript just calls that function back over and over and over again, whether there's 1 thing, 10 things, or 100 things in that array. That's why it's a callback function. It's getting called back automatically for every element in the array. The result of map is it returns a new array without modifying the result. And that's where we have our functional programming principle of immutability, meaning that we avoid mutating data in place as much as possible. We also have this word we've heard before called pure functions. So pure functions are ones, like it says here, there are no side effects on the external state. And that basically means that this function never reaches outside of its scope to look at anything else in the code. It's very isolated. This is just a function here. It sits around. It doesn't care whether you're working in the browser or working in a node server or anything in between. It's just going to sit there, and every time it receives a given input, it's going to return a given output every single time. It does not matter about anything, no external state outside of that function declaration. So if you are into math a little bit, then you will relate this to an algebraic function. Given a certain x, we always get back a certain y. Functional programming. So it produces a new array. So moving down here a little bit, we can get an idea of how this works. And now, of course, we would never make a variable just called array. That's pretty confusing. But just whatever, some type of an array. But you'll notice here that whenever we call map, we're going to want to capture that returned new array into a variable. Otherwise, it's just going to do all this work. And then the garbage collector is going to come there and say, ooh, that's a nice looking new array, but nobody's using it, so I'm just going to clean it up. So we want to capture or bind that returned array into a variable. And so the general format here is we take the array, and remember we said it was a map method. That means that we don't just say map, we have to say whatever array it is dot map, because the map method is something that can be called only on arrays. So if we take like some sort of a string and do string.map, that's not going to work. So map is a method that's scoped and sort of reserved only for arrays. So what do we have to do with the map method? Well, here we pass in a callback function. Now, if we look down here, the only thing that's required is a reference to the element, and that's all we see here. There's a 95% chance you don't need any of these optional arguments whenever you're using map. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can see that here. So in this case, they've written the function in line inside of the map. One could also just take this function and just keep it separate and then just call it out by name. Like maybe you just create a function like function and we call it square and everything else is the same. Number, return number times number. And then you would just pass the name of that function, whatever you decided to call it. But regardless, with map, you're passing in a callback function, and the only thing you really need is a reference to the element. Notice the naming here. Since this is an array, we call it numbers, plural. And then we say numbers.map, and this is a pretty common convention. To reference each individual element, we'll say number, singular. And that makes it pretty clear that we have a collection of numbers, and we're going to take each individual number and pass it into our callback function. Anyway, after all that is said and done, we get back a new array that we capture in this variable, and there's the output. And yes, you can also write this as an arrow function. So this is one of the simplest examples we can do with map, but we're going to be using map quite a bit going forward. So let's look at the rest of these notes here. Functional approach is a hallmark of functional programming. We've already kind of covered this. Immutability. This is a pure function, right? This function up here, if you were just to write this function separately, it doesn't do anything outside of its scope here. This is a pure function. Given the number 2, it's always going to produce the number 4. It's not console logging anything. It's not looking outside at any external state. Let's see, a higher order function. Yeah, I mean it's a higher order function because we're passing a function into another function. Just some terminology. And the declarative approach. It uses some fancy terminology here, but we can just say declarative means rather than spelling out the procedure in an imperative style of how to loop over an array, we just declare what we want done with our array. So the map method exemplifies functional programming, kind of repeats itself right there. So that is a high-level overview of the map method.